Alright, moving up the line to even more complex creatures, concept 33.3. Here is that word that's going to kill me every time. Lophotrochozoans. Lophotrochozoans is a clade identified by molecular data and have the widest range of animal body forms within the invertebrates that we're going to take a look at. If we go back to our phylogenetic tree, remember we basically said that we could divide creatures based on their symmetry, and this would be all your bilateria, all your bilateral symmetry creatures, but we could further subdivide them if we looked at morphological data just based on whether they were protostome or deuterostome. But if we looked at molecular data, we would divide them into these three particular groupings. So we're going to look at these three particular groupings, including this Lophotrochozoa, and then we'll look at the other two as well. So most animals belong to the clade bilateria, which means they have bilateral symmetry and triploblastic development. Most have a coelom and a digestive tract with two openings. The clade bilateria includes the three subgroupings that we already talked about: the Lophotrochozoa, the I forgot how to say this one, the Ecdysozoa, and the Deuterostomia. So at this point we're down to all of the creatures that have some form of bilateral symmetry, and we'll start with the Lophotrochozoa. Man, I'm going to stumble over that word all day long. This clade was identified by molecular data. Some of them have a particular feeding structure and others pass through a particular larval stage. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on these creatures, or we're certainly not going to spend a huge amount of time on all of the details, but we do want to point out some particular features or some particular examples of species. So they're going to include a huge variety: flatworms, rotifers, brachiopods, mollusks, annelids, and we'll take a look at just a few of them. Starting with the flatworms, the platyhelminthes, which is a word perhaps you've heard of before. They live in both marine, freshwater, and even damp terrestrial habitats. They undergo triploblastic development. They are acoelomates. So this is a good example of a creature that has three germ layers, but they lack a true coelom. They don't have a body cavity within inside them. They are flattened dorsoventrally and have gastrovascular cavity with one opening. So they're somewhat more familiar, or somewhat more like the jellyfish, in that they only have kind of a single opening in and out of their body. Gas exchange occurs across the surface of their body, and they have specialized body tubes that help regulate osmotic pressure within their bodies. Flatworms are divided into two lineages: chain worms, which we're going to take a look at. That would be like tapeworms that reproduce asexually by budding off of their back end. And then this other group, the Rhabditophora, are more diverse, and they include free-living and parasitic species. Here is a beautiful example of a marine flatworm, a free-living marine flatworm. A very simple creature. I mean, as you can see, it's basically just a ribbon of material. Not a lot there as far as specialized tissue or body parts. From some of the free-living species, perhaps the most well-known for most biology students or is a particular type of flatworm called a planarian. Planarians live in fresh water, and they can be found in ponds and creeks right here in Texas, right next to your school, I'm sure. They have light-sensitive eye spots, centralized nerve nets, not necessarily a true brain, but they have a more complex nervous system and a more centralized nervous system than, say, a cnidarian like a jellyfish have. Planarians are hermaphrodites and can reproduce sexually or asexually through fission. So they can reproduce sexually, but they can also simply divide themselves and continue on like that. So here is a illustration of a planarian, a good example of a commonly studied freshwater creature of a very simple design. Some of these various flatworms live in or on other animals and are parasitic. Trematodes and tapeworms are a good example of ones that might affect humans. Trematodes have a wide variety of hosts. They can infect humans as well. They spend part of their life between asexual and sexual stages. They spend part of their life in snails as hosts, but then they can also be transferred to humans, and they produce surface proteins that mimic their host and release molecules that then manipulate the host's immune system. So they can infect humans as well as other creatures, and they would be picked up in watery environments to where they have ciliated larvae, and then that will enter into a snail, and then they'll have motile larvae, and that can be picked up by a human. And here you have a female and a male version of this fluke that can then live inside of the human body and be parasitic. Not a very pretty picture. This is be 1 millimeter in length, the bar here. So this would be a creature that would live inside of you and be parasitic inside of you. Another common example that you might be familiar with, this would be also called a blood fluke, a trematode, oftentimes called a blood fluke. Another example you might be familiar with are tapeworms. Tapeworms are parasitic parasites of various vertebrates. They lack their own digestive system. They basically feed off of your digestive system. They absorb nutrients from the host's intestines. They have a scolex, which is kind of like their head. It's not really a true head, but it contains suckers and hooks for attaching to the host. And then they have what's called proglottids, which are units that contain sex organs, and they form a ribbon behind the scolex. And at the very end of that ribbon, fertilized eggs produced by sexual reproduction leave the host body in little segments, leave the host through the feces of the host. So here you have a tapeworm. At this portion you would have the end portions, the proglottids, that can be broken off and excreted when the host goes to the bathroom. And at this portion you have, I guess, what you would call the head. It's called the scolex, but it has hooks and suckers that allow this sucker to attach to your intestines inside of your body and live inside of your body. So that would be some of your basic flatworms, some of the basic planarians, tapeworms. These are all in the Lophotrichozoa. We're going to look at another one called the rotifer. So still in this particular group, these are all bilateral species, or they have bilateral symmetry. So let's go on and look at another example called a rotifer. Rotifers are very tiny little animals that inhabit freshwater, oceans, damp soils. They are smaller than a lot of protists, but they are multicellular, and they do have some specialized organs, so they're a little bit more complex than some of the other creatures we've looked at. They have a separate digestive tube that has a separate mouth and anus. So we're moving on up in the world. We don't have a mouth and anus that's all the same portion. So the rotifers have a very small, simple digestive tube that has two separate openings, and they are very unique because most of the examples of rotifers reproduce by a process called parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis is in which females produce offspring from unfertilized eggs. So most of these rotifers, as a matter of fact, the majority of these rotifers, they are only female, and it's rare to even find a male. Some of these species are unusual in that they lack males entirely, and as a matter of fact, we have fossilized evidence, fossilized amber, which would be fossilized tree sap, that contains some of these rotifers that show that some of these species of rotifers, going back for almost 100 million years, we can find no male version of these rotifers, which is very unique, very odd. I think I might have a video inside the Chapter 33 folder. Here is a little rotifer, very tiny little guy, or I should say girl, because for the most part they're all female. So that's a very interesting species, and scientists study the rotifer because it's difficult to understand, especially over the span of millions of years of evolution. Why would this parthenogenesis continue to be the way that they go throughout life and reproduce? So rotifers, unique because of the fact that pretty much, for the most part, most of the species of them are all female. The last group in this particular category we're going to look at are called the mollusks. Phylum Mollusca includes snails and slugs, oysters and clams, octopus and squids, quite the variety as well. Most mollusks are marine, although some inhabit freshwater, and of course, like snails and slugs, some of them are terrestrial, land-dwelling creatures. Mollusks tend to be soft-bodied animals, but many of them are protected by a hard shell, as you're probably familiar. All mollusks have a similar body plan with three main parts. They have a muscular foot, they have a visceral mass, basically, of internal organs, and they have what's called a mantle. Many mollusks also have a water-filled mantle cavity, and they feed using what's called a radula. A radula is kind of a rasp-like comb sort of mouth part. A lot of them scrape algae off of rocks or pick up algae and small materials off of the ground and that type of thing, and they use their radula to do that. So let's take a look at the basic body plan of a mollusk. We have a foot, a lower portion, and this doesn't matter if you're talking about a clam or a snail. They have this foot area here. Oftentimes they have a radula, their mouth part. You can see right here kind of a scraping little mouth part. They have inside their digestive tract, they have what's called a visceral mass, which would basically be all of their guts, all of their organs inside. And then they have an exterior sort of mantle. And then over the top of the mantle, many of them may have a shell. Some do not, but many do have a shell. So you can see they're quite a bit more complex than some of the other creatures we've already looked at. You're starting to see particular body parts and organs and more of a developed digestive system. Certainly they have a separate mouth and anus, and so you're starting to see a bit more complexity. Perhaps not a true brain, but they do have a basic nervous system that runs throughout most of the body as well. Most of the mollusks have separate sexes with gonads located somewhere in that visceral mass, but many snails are hermaphrodites. So again, we still see the more simple types of sexual reproduction here. The life cycle of many of the marine mollusks include a ciliated larval stage called a trochophore. So again, we're still seeing kind of a larval stage where the initial offspring look different from the final adult. Sorry about that, computer went crazy for a minute. For the major classes of mollusks, there are more than 4 major classes, but we're only going to briefly look at 4 of the major classes of mollusks just because they are probably the most common ones. So before we do that, let's take a quick break and we'll come back and look at the major classes of mollusks, and then we'll wrap up this particular section.